right, we're going to switch gears and we are going to talk about crime trends and patterns in delinquency. According to the UCR, actually, I'm going to give you an overview generally and then I'll switch to delinquency arrest trends. According to the UCR, the crime rates had been gradually increasing between the 1930s and the 1960s. In the 1960s, the crime rate grew significantly. The 1980s saw an increase in crime, especially in robbery, motor vehicle theft, and homicide. But the crime rates began to peak in 1991, with 15 million crimes in 1 year. And that's reported. The UCR is reported in arrests. And then it's been decreasing ever since. And in 2015, 9.2 million crimes were reported, despite a significant increase in the U.S. population. And of course, despite media reports that state otherwise. Violent crimes are dropping, as well as property crimes, such as theft and arson. They've decreased too, but still remain a significant problem, resulting in annual losses of about $17 billion each year. So delinquency arrests, let's talk about that. We talked about the Part 1 crimes in the last segment. Juveniles are responsible for about 11% of those Part 1 crimes, the serious crimes, murder, rape, etc. And teens between the ages of 14 and 17 account for almost all underage arrests. And looking at that number as a whole, that's 6%, those 14 to 17-year-olds, the 6% of the population. So the data seems to show, in conclusion, that teens account for a significantly disproportionate share of the arrests. And this number doesn't include the Part 2 offenses, those less serious crimes and those status offenses. Remember the status offenses from Chapter 1? Those ones that only pertain to youth: truancy, curfew, drinking, underage drinking. With that combined, we're looking at 1 million teens arrested just for those Part 2 crimes. But good news, despite these trends, the overall crime rate arrest is going down. So is the juvenile arrest rate. That's been declining since the mid-90s as well. Let's talk about victimization trends. And this is based on those reporting measurements that we just discussed. The NCVS data shows that criminal victimization has declined significantly during the past 30 years, and then we're dealing with the age group of 12-year-olds and older. Remember the survey? It's done by the U.S. Census Bureau. Since 1993, the rate of violent victimization has declined 80%. That's overall. The rate of serious violent crimes against youths between the ages of 12 and 17 has decreased. And overall, the youthful victimization has declined 70% since the mid-90s. So again, despite the media saying that crime is out of control and it's now more dangerous than ever before in U.S. history, that is actually not the case. The 19th century crime rates were much higher than they are now. Let's talk about, before I talk about what the future holds, let's talk about the self-reported patterns and trends. The trends that I just mentioned above were based on the NCVS survey for the victims. The self-reported surveys, those are the offenders that are reporting, show that the number of children who break the law is actually quite higher. Remember our dark figures? We have those crimes that go undetected. The most common offenses reported on those self-reported surveys: truancy, alcohol use, using a false ID, shoplifting, shoplifting involving items less than $5, fighting, pot use, damaging other people's property. Those are the most common offenses reported. The annual self-report survey conducted each year by the Monitoring the Future, it's referenced on page 41, reports that 8% teens reported hurting someone so bad they needed medical attention. 20% said they stole something that was worth $50 or less. And 17% said that was worth more than that, something more than $50. 3% used force to steal. That's the definition of robbery, right? That they use force to steal. That's robbery. And that is, and as of that, according to the UCR, this is a significant number. If teens are reporting that they've committed a robbery or they had force to steal, that's a huge significance if that's counted in the data. That gives us a number of 1.2 million robberies per year, which is significantly different from what the UCR was reporting, with 300,000 being reported. So, as I said, this is detecting the unreported crimes. So that's a big number. You review these teen self-reported crimes. It's on page 42, and take a look. But despite these numbers, still the consensus from the data sources is that crime among the youth is declining. So what factors account for the change in crime and delinquency? We're going to get to that question momentarily, but now I want to address what the future holds. What does the future hold? Think of this question. If the increase in teen population keeps growing, will juvenile crime increase? Especially looking at the at-risk youths, as we'll discuss later in this chapter. That number's on the rise. And while it may rise, criminologists believe that that number might be offset by senior citizens who are living longer. So it might not rise as much, the crime rate. Other factors that play a role: current economic conditions, social unrest. Look at the state of our country's affairs right now. It's very hard to predict what the future will hold, except that we know that the teen population is growing, the senior citizens are living a little longer, but we also know that at-risk youths commit more of the crimes, and that number is on the rise. We're going to talk more about that under chronic offenders. Let's talk about the correlates of delinquency. What do I mean by that? It's the patterns that may exist, such as traits or social characteristics associated with adolescent behavior, adolescent misbehavior, and then that information could provide a guide for treatment or prevention. So let's examine traits and patterns that influence behavior and ultimately the crime rate among adolescents. Ecological patterns: place, time, season, climate. The rural, suburban areas have lower delinquent behavior than urban, which is higher. Why might that be? Overcrowding, poverty, drug use, social inequalities, racial conflicts. All of those things create a role in crime, less education opportunities. But even in the large cities, that's not all areas are subject to the same level of crime. It could be limited to blocks in certain neighborhoods. They in turn have their own ecological factors, like a housing project, for instance, or one of the others above. What else plays a role? Seasons play a role. Summer, more crime. More adolescent misbehavior in the summertime than any other season. Why is that? Because they're outside more. There's no school. Temperatures are hot. There's more vulnerability to property crime when no one's around at home. They're outside, they're on vacation, doing other things. A lot of crimes happen in a public place, and if you're outdoors more likely to be a victim. Crimes are more likely to happen at night than the day. That makes sense. There's not, if most crimes happen in public places and people are mostly home at night, whoever is still out is, subject to victimization, but also more likely to potentially commit a crime. Regions. It's also regions. The West and the South have higher delinquency rates than the Midwest and New England. And criminologists seem to believe that's the difference in economics. Or others claim cultural values play a role. Gun ownership plays a role. The population makeup also plays a role. Another area where we see patterns and trends. Before I get to gender, I want to talk about co-offending and crime. The crime tends to happen, according to the data, in groups, especially with adolescents. There's an idea that there's safety in numbers. There's more bang for your buck. You get if you're going to commit a crime of let's say stealing, there's more people, there's more to take. But actually, it's far from the truth. They're more likely to get caught when crimes happen in groups, and there actually is, according to the research, less bang for the buck, meaning less property is being stolen per offender, despite what is thought by the adolescent. Gender patterns. Males tend to commit more crime than female, and this is more towards violent crimes. It's on the other end, the less violent crimes. It's almost even out. But why is that? More likely, more delinquent relative to violent crimes. They're stronger, so they're able to commit them better. There's hormonal differences that make men more aggressive. Females are socialized to be less aggressive and strongly discouraged to engage in anti-behavior. Females have better verbal skills and use them to diffuse conflict. Males tend to be granted greater personal freedom and hence more opportunities to commit crime. Females are kind of under more greater parental controls. But like I said, today there are more similarities than differences between the male and the female delinquents. There are certain crimes, though, that are specific to girls that girls are more likely to commit. Girls are more likely to run away or commit one of the other status offense. The boys for status offense are more likely to break curfew. Also, girls are more likely to be arrested for prostitution. But overall, delinquency arrest rate for both sexes is on the decline. Let's talk about race and delinquency. Racial patterns, this is one of the most complex issues for criminologists. Minority groups involved in delinquency. There's a disproportionate share of criminal activity relative to these statistics from all reporting sources, which includes the self-reporting surveys as well. As you can get from the reading material, African American males have been arrested 30% more than white males, which is 22%, and that number is based on being arrested once before the age of 18. So males that are reporting, African American males are reporting 30% more arrested versus 22%. There are some studies looked into this. The difference may be the function of racism practice within the criminal justice system. And if you haven't taken Intro to Criminal Justice yet, or maybe you're taking it now, you know that the criminal justice system, or if you don't, I'm going to tell you, is made up of law enforcement, courts, and corrections. Institutional bias, the treatment of African Americans by law enforcement, has become a significant national concern. We have racial profiling, which is the stopping and searching of African American men. That happens more to African Americans and minorities than it does Caucasians. The police can, and the Supreme Court has said it was fine for them to do if they have a quote-unquote reasonable suspicion that criminal behavior is afoot or about to happen. An example of this is if a young African American man is walking in a predominantly white neighborhood and a police car goes by and quote unquote seems out of place, that in law enforcement's opinion could be a basis for a reasonable stop and search. These are all things that, in light of all of the events in the last 6 months in this country, that are now becoming really under the microscope. And it's going to have to take legislation change for that to happen, because our Supreme Court has made rulings. I just told you what one ruling was. But it's going to take the governments of each state and potentially Congress to make those changes. But not just law enforcement. But it's not just what I'm talking about. I'm going back to what we're talking about, I'm not digressing. Institutional bias, it's not just law enforcement. Minorities are more likely to be detained and incarcerated. They're also subject to longer sentences and even minor crimes. So while the microscope is on law enforcement, there's other parts of the criminal justice system that makes up quote-unquote institutional bias, according to the criminologists. There's another theory, the racial threat hypothesis or theory. And according to that theory, as the size of the African American population increases, the perceived threat to the white population increases, resulting in a greater amount of social control, in parentheses, in quotes, by the criminal justice system, is imposed on African Americans. And according to the theory, white residents in a neighborhood overestimate the proportion of minorities living in the neighborhood, which leads to a false perception of disorder. Hence, they complain. Police aggressively patrol, they search, they arrest, they look for minor things like being out of place in a neighborhood, and giving rise to the minority crime rate. That's a theory. The structural racism theory. This is an assumption that affects crime rate, or the assumption is that it affects crime rate. And that racial discrimination that has spread throughout or has been present in American society for the last hundreds of years has resulted in economic and social disparity. And as a result, minority youths face social isolation, economic deprivation, underfunded or segregated schools, more so than Caucasian. And because of these disparities, they become involved in more criminal activity. So that is the trends and patterns or discussion that criminologists have relative to race and delinquency. Let's talk about social class and delinquency. First of all, kids in all classes and levels of society commit crime. Serious crime is more prevalent in socially disorganized lower class areas, whereas less serious crimes are spread evenly throughout social classes. Generally, those are the Part 2 classes or the status offenses. And some of the things that are looked into to determine what might be affecting delinquency, or the social classes affecting delinquency. There was a question on whether unemployment rates played a role, but when employment rates are higher, people tend to stay home more, and it does not seem to affect the crime rate. However, unemployment is higher in deprived inner cities, regardless of the status of the country, the economic status of the country. And the reason for that is there's more poverty, there's more social discord. Lower class youth become responsible for the majority of serious crimes. They're also subject to more arrests, and of course that increased the arrest data. Lack in economic and social opportunities strain these residents, which in turn then strains the youth, and then they in turn turn to crime. Youth also believe that they just can't compete with their adolescent peers from more affluent areas. Broken homes. When there's broken families, no youth supervision. Gangs are more prevalent in these areas. There's no ability to exert social control over the youth. This is what the research says. This is what the criminologists find. But they also find that poverty per se is not a cause, because there are kids from poor families that do not commit crimes. However, it is a link to social problems. So social class plays a role in delinquency. Age patterns and delinquency. Younger people commit crimes. The peak age is 16 years old for property crimes. The peak age for violent crimes is 18. Elderly people don't commit crimes. Males, if we're talking about elderly people, 65, males, age 65 or older, they tend to commit DWI crimes, driving while intoxicated crimes, while the females tend to commit shoplifting crimes. But why young people? Why do young people commit crimes? They're the risk takers, immature, limited financial resources. They have the energy, physical strength, and skill to pull it off. The juvenile justice system isn't as harsh as the adult system. We'll get to that a little later this semester. Talk about the juvenile court system. So if you're getting into trouble, punishment is a lot less severe. There's also less supervision and responsibilities. There's also a link to biology, the level of hormones that affects behavior. That's another factor. There's a aging out process, aging out of crime. Crime seems to peak, according to the data. Crime peaks at adolescence and declines thereafter. It also stems from the function of natural history and the human cycle. The desire that fuels criminal activity starts to subside, and experts have developed a number of reasons for this aging out process. I already said one above, changes in human biology. That's one. And growing older means having to face the future. Maturity comes with the ability to resist the quick fix to a problem option. the youth tend to turn to crime to fix their problem, or they have frustration. Taking out of frustration might turn to crime. If you're mad at somebody, rather than work out the problem, a young person might assault them. As you get older, you find more conventional ways to solve problems. There's also, with maturity comes responsibilities. There's an increase in responsibilities. Personalities change. And they actually become aware of the risks that come with committing crime. As I said earlier, now once you're an adult, you're in an adult court. If you commit a crime, the stakes are a lot higher. However, there are still adolescents that carry delinquent behavior into adulthood, and unfortunately they become chronic offenders. And we're going to get into that section next. I want to talk about factors. I brought it up a little earlier. Factors that influence delinquency rate trends. I'm going to ask you to explore this more. It's on page 44. It's actually part of this week's assignment. But I just want to touch on factors that affect delinquency rate trends. Age, structure. These might not be in any sort of order on my slide. These are the ones that I want you to consider in the book. Uptick in crime when we have a younger society, right? And I said earlier, we have a surge in the teen population, so we're turning toward a younger society. And as we just explored, the youth commit more crimes than adults do, so there's a potential of this factor of seeing an uptick in crime. But on the flip side, healthcare is improving, and with that, older people are living longer, so it might very well balance out the crime rate. Immigration, communities with large immigrant population decrease in crime. Immigrants are less likely to commit crimes. Social problems, when there's a drop in social problems, the delinquency rate drops. Abortion, since abortion was legalized, the crime rate dropped relative to abortion. Gun availability. There's always two views to this guns and crime, and there's really no concrete evidence for either view. But one is you take the guns away, you restrict the ability to self-defend, and the other side of that is too many guns in population increases violent crimes. However, with regards to gun availability and research, there's an increase in students carrying guns and having access to guns, which then in turn can cause an increase in serious violent crimes. So adolescents are carrying guns. Gangs, there's an uptick in teenage gangs, and they're responsible for a large portion of the violent crimes. Drug use, proof. There is research that shows that use of drugs results in an uptick in violence. The media, I'll put the media and the internet in the same category, but cybercrimes are on the increase. Media, does media have an influence on crime? Does it curb violence? That's always a question. There's not a lot of research one way or the other, but I think if you spend time one day and you're on your social media or listening to the news, whether you get it from TV or radio or some YouTube or app or whatever you follow, you should keep track one day and see how many times you hear something about a crime. That'll give you an idea of how much a role that media plays. Justice policy, juvenile justice policy, added law enforcement and harsher penalties on crimes, having an aggressive policing towards delinquent behavior. Would that have an effect on the crime rate? Research says so. It would make the crime, you see a decrease in delinquency, crime rate. So anyway, that was just a quick overview of factors affecting delinquency. It's part of this week's assignment, so you check that out on page 44, and you'll see it on Moodle under the assignments on what exactly you have to do. The next topic is chronic offenders, and here's where we will visit a cohort research study.